This week on Waterways, Fort Jefferson's historic military presence, and the Queen of Nassau. August 1814. In the heat of the night, Americans taking refuge in Leesburg, Virginia, watched the British burn and loot their capital.
They sailed into Chesapeake Bay, and thousands of British soldiers marched overland. They captured Washington, D.C., and they burned our nation's capital to the ground. Consequently, as Congress returned to the smoldering ruins of our capital, they promised the American people that that would never happen again.
In the aftermath of British invasion, Congress authorized the construction of a series of 51 forts to protect the country's long and vulnerable coastline from Maine to Texas. More forts were planned and built for the West Coast following the addition of California to the Union.
Homeland defense was crucial in the early 1800s, and the leaders of our young nation, they had to build these fortifications. For if we had failed to fortify our vulnerable coasts, that would have been an invitation to disaster.
One of the largest and most expensive of these forts was Fort Jefferson, located on Garden Key, 70 miles west of Key West. To land dwellers, this sandy island seems to lie in the middle of nowhere, but to sailors, it's in the heart of what has been for centuries one of the world's busiest shipping channels. Ships coming from South America, the Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico must pass this point if they want to take advantage of the swift-moving Gulf Stream. The U.S. put its outer line of defense at this natural gateway next to the shipping lanes, where they would be seen by foreign ships.
There were many foreign vessels that visited our harbors. They would see these very impressive fortifications, and word would naturally get back to their homelands, to their countries, that the United States was building some very, very large and sophisticated coastal defenses.
To give potential invaders pause, the U.S. used the most advanced military tools available at the time. The first of these tools was architecture.
Earlier forts tended to be only one tier high. They were a solid brick or earth wall with one row of cannon mounted on top. In the example of Fort Jefferson, these walls tower into the sky. They're 45 feet high, made possible by the use of the casemate arch that can support, in this case, 3 levels or 3 tiers of heavy cannons.
To make the fort look even more imposing, military architects built a row of blind embrasures between the second and third tiers. The embrasures were designed to look like holes for a cannon. From a distance, an enemy would be fooled into thinking there were 4 rows of heavy cannons bearing on them, not just 3.
Fort Jefferson was built during what some consider the golden age of fort construction here in the United States. What we did is we took designs that were common throughout Europe. We took those designs and we improved them to a fairly dramatic scale. Our fortification this time period reflected the apex, the very top of coastal fort design.
Fort Jefferson was a technological marvel, the stealth bomber of its day. Sophisticated cannon openings provided a wide field of fire, roughly 60 degrees of traverse, while still providing maximum shelter from enemy fire. When coupled with the fort's hexagonal or 6-sided shape, that 60 degrees could be extremely deadly.
That was a fairly magic number. It allowed, for example, all or most cannons on 2 adjoining walls to fire at the same naval target at the same time. That, in the case of Fort Jefferson, that could be as many as 175 heavy cannon. Massive amount of firepower. European forts, because of their limitations, could not produce the same firepower.
Though Fort Jefferson showcased new tools, it also used some very old technologies, moats and bastions.
The thing to remember, it's not the moat, it's the moat wall. The moat wall is this ribbon of brickwork that surrounds the fort. It shelters it from waves. It's like a breakwater. Now, the moat wall also has another important function. It serves to keep the enemy at arm's length. It prevents an enemy warship from sailing right up against the walls of the fort and allowing them to disgorge soldiers and Marines right through the fort's openings or over the top of the fort's walls.
The large bastions, built on the 6 corners of the fort, made it possible to sweep the surrounding waters with deadly, close-range cannon fire, protecting the fort's flanks and adding to its impenetrability.
Bastion allows you to mount a smaller type of howitzer that's not aimed out towards sea. Instead, it's aimed down the length of your own wall. A flank defense howitzer provides deadly, close-in coverage for the fort. It prevents enemy soldiers, perhaps in a rowboat, any sort of effort at trying to get across the moat, climb through, or climb over the fort's walls.
While the architecture of Fort Jefferson made it innovative, what made the fort truly imposing was the power of its guns. Begun in the 1840s, Fort Jefferson took advantage of historic advances in gun-making and design.
Prior to the 1840s, there was a practical limit to the size that you could safely make a large cannon, made of cast iron, mainly because they were prone to bursting. You know, firing these large projectiles using these heavy powder charges put a lot of stress, a lot of strain on these guns, and they would tragically burst, sometimes killing the crews that stood nearby. Starting in the 1840s, some scientific thought and some very practical applications started to see the development of some casting methods that made much, much stronger and far more durable cast iron cannons.
One event and one man ushered in this new era of gun-making. In 1844, a tragic accident occurred aboard the warship USS Princeton. During a publicity tour for President John Tyler and other dignitaries, one of the Princeton's cannons exploded violently. The explosion killed the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Navy, and a member of Congress. In response to this tragedy, Thomas Jackson Rodman, a young ordnance officer, committed himself to designing a better, safer gun. Instead of casting a cannon solid and then hollowing out the bore, the way guns have been made for centuries, Rodman cast the cannon hollow around an internal sleeve. During the cooling process, water pumped into the core hardened the inside first. Rodman's method resulted in a gun that was much stronger and much less likely to burst.
Prior to his innovations, cannons were limited in size. They could fire a cannonball that was about the size of a bowling ball, weighing 128 pounds. With his innovation, cannons could now be produced that could fire something the size of a beach ball that weighed 432 pounds.
Rodman's casting method was just one innovation. Another was the development of the rifled bore. A rifled bore has spiraled grooves down the barrel that gives the projectile a tight spin, just like a football spiraling through the air. Rifled cannons could fire much farther and more accurately than smoothbore cannon, and they packed more of a punch.
The round cannonball, it wobbles in flight. It leaves the cannon at a fairly high velocity, but it loses so much momentum in flight. Usually at extreme range, it's only going to have about a third of its initial velocity left. So even if a smoothbore cannon were fortunate enough to hit a target, at a long range, it's not going to have a lot of momentum left.
The use of rifled cannons also led to the development of improved ammunition. Exploding cannonballs were common in the 19th century, but they suffered many shortcomings. As a round cannonball tumbled and rolled in flight, it was impossible to control the part of the ball that would strike the target. Since this made the use of impact fuses impossible, cannoneers were forced to use unreliable and cumbersome time fuses.
In the heat of battle, standing behind a cannon, the crew would have to judge their distance to their target. They would have to cut or adjust the fuse accordingly, load the fuse, load the cannonball into the cannon, fire the cannon, and hope for the best. What would often happen is, well, sometimes the cannonball would explode inside the cannon, or just in front, or perhaps not at all.
A rifled projectile is bullet-shaped and hits nose first, every time. For the first time, ammunition could safely use impact fuses that exploded upon contact. This was a huge help for cannon crews, and eliminated much of the guesswork in preparing time fuses. From the top level of Fort Jefferson, you can survey all of the elements that made the fort such an imposing presence in the Gulf. This collection of Rodman smoothbores is the largest of its kind in existence.
We still have 6 of these large 15-inch Rodmans. They were sold to scrap dealers, as were all the cannons here at Fort Jefferson. Fortunately for us today, the scrap dealers managed to haul off all those smaller cannons, weighing about 7 tons apiece. But they took one look at these 25-ton behemoths, and thank goodness they decided it wasn't worth the effort. So even though these cannons were sold to scrap dealers by 1902, they're still here today because the scrap dealers couldn't haul them off.
The big smoothbores and rifled Parrott cannons were never fired at an enemy. The moat walls were never crossed. Fort Jefferson was never engaged in battle. This has led some to suggest that the big fort was a waste of government time and money. But this view ignores the job the fort was designed to do.
Perhaps the true military significance of Fort Jefferson, it was designed not to be used in combat, but instead to be used as a powerful deterrent. And when sophisticated forts like Fort Jefferson were woven into a whole network of coastal defenses, it projected a powerful and undeniable symbol that the United States wanted to be left alone.
And it has been left alone. There has been no invasion by sea of the U.S. since the War of 1812. Built to keep the peace, peace now surrounds it. If you've heard about marine sanctuaries, you probably associate them with protecting marine creatures and the oceans where they live, and rightly so. But what many people don't realize is that protecting our nation's cultural resources that lie underwater is another major component of the National Marine Sanctuary Program mission.
In the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, submerged cultural resources are often underrepresented in our to the public because of all the issues concerning coral and seagrass and marine life that's easy to access and to see. It's very visible. Submerged cultural resources are often invisible because they're either buried by sand or infrequently covered and uncovered by shifting sediments.
The first ever National Marine Sanctuary, established in 1975, protected the wreck of the Civil War ironclad, the USS Monitor, off the coast of North Carolina. The protection of these submerged cultural resources helps preserve maritime history, giving us a porthole to the past. On the USS Monitor, the journey takes the visitor to the heart of the Civil War. In the Keys, the journey is equally exciting.
The story behind it is almost like a puzzle that needs to be pieced back together, and you figure out the fabric of how it got there and who was involved in putting it there. Was there loss of life? And the story behind them is really what's interesting.
In August of 2001, Dave Score received reports of a nearly pristine shipwreck in sanctuary waters 8 miles offshore from Lower Matecumbe, near Island Murata. Found in 220 feet of water, the wreck intrigued Score, who coordinates submerged cultural resource issues for the sanctuary, and he set in motion plans for an expedition to learn more about the sunken vessel.
A member of the Association of Underwater Explorers obtained some coordinates of a potential shipwreck, which was a good fishing spot in some deep water in the sanctuary. And as a shipwreck enthusiast, he had a keen eye to say, well, this could be something worth investigating.
Sanctuary Upper Region Manager Dave Score called in archaeological expertise from NOAA's Monitor National Marine Sanctuary and diving operations expertise from the NOAA-funded National Undersea Research Center at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington.
Our first expedition out to the site, again, we just as an unidentified vessel, we didn't really know what it was other than it was probably steel or iron. We weren't quite sure. It is obviously steam powered because we saw there's props instead of sort of sail powered. But we went in, the site, it's deep, it's 220 feet, it's always dark down there. Visibility, if you're lucky, sometimes 30 feet. And what's also very neat about the site, which helps, of course, in the site mapping, is that she's totally intact on top of the sand. It's almost unheard of in archaeology. You know, it's sort of a gift from the heavens above, giving you this pristine wreck site to map. We try to find all the diagnostic features that would help in site identification. We looked all over the site for any sort of name board, some sort of plaque, anything that with a name on it of the vessel. We didn't find anything. So even on the artifacts that we recovered for dating purposes, there was nothing on that as well. So we're just left with these dimensions of the vessel to try to identify it.
4 days of diving translated into 4 months of research for Casterly once the first expedition ended. The ship's distinctive ram bow turned out to be the key to identifying the vessel. The ram bow is an elongated beak on the front of the ship, initially employed during the Civil War for ramming other vessels.
Each nation had its own design for ram bow, whether it be Germany, United States, Great Britain, France, and the ram bow that we have on the Queen of Nassau most closely matches that of a British cruiser. So using that, I tried to backtrack it as well, but there's no British warships of those dimensions. So I had to look at the vessels that are related to Britain. So there's all the colonies, the Commonwealths, the Dominions. So that would be Australia, New Zealand, and Canada was one of those. So I backtracked all the Canadian vessels I could find, which were, there's a lot of them that were similar, but none of them were that large, until I came across one that was called the Canada, which belonged to their fisheries protection fleet. But what was interesting, it actually said it sank 50 miles south of Miami in 1926. I thought, wow, you know, we might be onto something here. Problem was the vessels didn't match. So when I did more and more research into the Canada, I actually found that they changed the vessel's construction and raised up her bow area, her forecastle, to almost exactly what we have now on the bottom.
No longer a mystery, the vessel turned out to have an illustrious past. Vickers, Maxim & Sons, Ltd. in Barrow in Furness, England, built the Canada in 1904. Known as the fastest ship in the Fisheries Protection Fleet, the vessel became Canada's first naval training ship and later was commissioned into the newly formed Canadian Navy. In 1919, the Canada was decommissioned, and in 1924, the Canadian government sold the vessel to Baron Collier, a wealthy Florida landowner. When the aged ship proved too slow for service as an inter-island cruise ship, Collier made plans to sell it to Mexican interests, but the ship accidentally sank in 1926. But was it an accident? As Casterly studied the reports from the ship's captain and compared it to the ship's appearance on the bottom, a mystery surfaced.
They're coming south, just off Isla Morada, when all of a sudden the fireman of the boilers comes running up to the captain saying, "There's water coming in, there's water coming in. What do we do?" So he says, "Okay, start the pumps, see if we can save the vessel." When the fireman went back down below, the water actually passed his knees already. So obviously something sort of catastrophic happened for that much water to be rushing forward. So they actually battled the oncoming water for about an hour and a half. The captain's starting to realize that he's not going to be able to save the ship. He decides instead of beaching it, he takes out into deeper water. In his words, so it wasn't a navigational hazard. But he also states that 8 minutes later, the bow of the vessel went up into the air and hovered there about 25 feet out of the water. And then he says that he saw the hull crumple and the bow explode like an eggshell with the boilers exploding. Well, in our investigation of the site, there's nothing at all wrong with the vessel. She's as clean as the day she went down, except for the concretions. So I believe what we might have is a case of insurance scam.
Piecing together stories through underwater archaeology poses inherent difficulties. But the Queen of Nassau site's extreme depth multiplied these challenges. Sanctuary Program officials turned to NOAA's National Undersea Research Program, which had developed expertise in that arena during the missions on the Monitor, located in 235 feet of water. The dangers increase significantly when a diver descends past the normal recreational depths, or about 130 feet. Overcoming the obstacles posed by dives to this depth requires careful attention to breathing gases, redundant equipment, and rigid adherence to decompression schedules. Divers must be prepared to handle any problem underwater, since they face probable illness if they surface before decompression is complete.
For a 20 to 25 minute dive to 230 feet, for the team of 4 or 5 divers, they're looking at an additional 60 to 80 minutes of in-water decompression. So from start to finish, we're at about an hour 20, hour 30 minutes from top to bottom.
Without technical diving, projects such as the Queen of Nassau and the Monitor would not be possible, and part of our maritime past would remain lost beneath the sea. The techniques researchers are practicing and perfecting in these expeditions promise to lead to new discoveries in both the cultural and biological realms.
The problem with diving in general has been limited to about 130 feet, and then ROVs and submersibles have been going down, say 300 and beyond. So there's a range, there's kind of a realm that we're missing between, say, 130 and 300 feet. It's too deep for recreational diving or our standard scuba diving, and our other remote instruments and robotics are missing that zone. So this kind of opens up a window that hasn't been available until the advent of technical diving.
While work to document the site continues, the new challenge the explorers and sanctuary officials face is how to share their discoveries. Surveying and preserving an archaeological site is only one part of the sanctuary's mission.
Well, I think the research that we're doing now on the Queen of Nassau and all the field work, it's really important, not just for the people of the Florida Keys, for this great historic resource just offshore, but also, maybe even more so, for the people of Canada, where this was really the vessel that brought them into the 20th century, brought them into modern times, and it was essentially lost for about 80 years. And it's really neat to be able to do this research, to find it, to identify it, and to go back to people of Canada and say, hey, look, we found this again for you. And we've had a lot of interest going back and forth between their government and ours.
Early on, project team members recovered several artifacts thought to be in danger of disturbance. With assistance from the state of Florida, these objects have been conserved to prevent deterioration and are now on display at the sanctuary's Key Largo office. Researchers hope that divers who visit the site will obey the law and leave it undisturbed, so that everyone can share in the experience.
When everything fell down, when the ship came down, she crashed onto the bottom stern first and everything collapsed, that tells a story. It's like a crime scene. If you start moving little bits and pieces, that changes the story. So just like in a crime scene, if you want to figure out who did the murder, well, I'm doing the same thing. I want to figure out why the vessel went down, how she went down, what she was, and by disturbing those things, it totally changes the story.
The sanctuary may bring the story of the Queen of Nassau to the public by adding the site to its shipwreck trail. The shipwreck trail features wrecks throughout the Keys dating from the 1700s to the modern day. Buoys mark each site, and brochures and underwater site guides are available to orient divers to the site and provide a window into the fascinating maritime history of the Florida Keys.